Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to this publication-focused workshop. So this is what I was planning to cover, and I will try and talk for no more than half an hour, and there'll be quite a bit of time then for people's questions. So we're going to talk about different types of publication for different audiences, not just by any means just academic publications, but then I will focus on academic publishing, particularly in journals, and some advice around that. And then finally, some more general tips for getting things written and getting them out in print, which are not specific to any particular kind of medium, but just more generally how to get things written. So I should say, by way of introduction, my own field is social care. Okay, I'm a social care researcher. This is not a talk about publishing social care research. It's a talk about publishing research, and I'm thinking of the broad field of health and social care, such as Health and Care Research Wales covers. But there may well be aspects, people may have questions which relate to some particular aspect of NHS structures. I don't have experience of doing research in the NHS as an NHS employee, so apologies if I don't know the answers to everything quite as you would like them, but I will try and make the whole thing general. And just to say, in case anybody's wondering, who the target audience is people who are not very experienced in getting published. Okay, so if there's anybody who's got 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, this is probably not the session for you. Yeah, okay, that's by way of introduction. So I'll crack on then with different kinds of publications for different audiences and why this might be important. Okay, so the first question to ask is who reads journal papers? So for many people, the most obvious form of publication for research would be a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, it is the most well-respected form of publication. I think it's true, and we'll come on and say much more about that in a minute. But it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of people will never read a journal paper. I think things are improving in terms of the accessibility of journal papers in recent years, with more and more journals making their papers or some of their papers open access. So you don't need to be registered with the university in order to be able to open them, but everybody can open them. But even then, we have to bear in mind that depending on who our target audience is, a peer-reviewed journal is not necessarily the way to go. So, if you want to reach busy practitioners, if you even want your research to be accessible to, patients of the NHS and service users in social care, then clearly, putting a rather dense article requiring a fairly high level of education to understand it in an academic journal is not the most obvious way to go. So I'll come on in a minute to other formats. Yeah, I guess the other thing to say is that it is a very crowded market. There's a lot of evidence out there, so I think all of us need to be selective in what we decide to publish and not publishing for the sake of it. So I've grayed out in this list the more academic forms of publication, which I'm going to come on and say more about in a minute. But I just wanted to highlight that there are, of course, and I won't be telling you anything you don't know here, other formats for publishing research findings, which can be more suitable for certain audiences. I should also say, I mean, the world is too full of all of these things. All of these things have massively mushroomed with the accessibility of web publishing. So there's probably loads more blogs out there than anybody ever needs to read. And the same is true for podcasts and videos and magazine articles. But we do have these media, which can be a much more immediate and accessible way of presenting key messages for quick consumption. Yeah, so a blog is typically a very short thing, maybe just a few hundred words and no more, definitely less than 1,000 words. And it is written in a more engaging style. So that could be the way to go, perhaps a little bit more of a personal account sometimes, about what a particular research finding means to you. That can sometimes be a very helpful way of getting across key messages. Podcast is a much longer and more discursive thing. In fact, personally, I find some podcasts positively long and rambly, but it is another format that you have, which again can be much more easy to listen to for many people than to read a dense journal article. Videos, short and long. I mean, I think most people who know anything about this would urge short rather than long. Because we all develop a short attention span, don't we? In the era of TikTok and similar, even if we've never used those platforms in our lives, we're all aware of the existence of short videos. So, if you're going to make a video about research findings, don't make it last 10 minutes. You might want to make it last 2 or 3 minutes and just use it for getting across those absolutely top headlines. You're not going to get nuance across, obviously, in a short video, and therefore, like all these other media, it has its limitations. When I say magazine or newspaper article, I'm thinking perhaps they're specifically about publications that are aimed at a certain practitioner audience. So, for example, in the social care field, you have community care. There are online magazines which are specifically geared towards short, accessible summaries of research work. An example being The Conversation. Some of you might have seen that. It's very broad. It will publish pretty much anything. I think there are no limits in terms of the coverage of topics. They just need to be sure that what you are publishing is going to be of interest to an audience. Right, so I'm going to move on. I'm going to say a lot more today about the more conventional form of research publishing, which is to publish your research in journals and similar. But I wanted to start off by acknowledging that that is not the only way to go and is not always the best thing to do. So why do academic publishing then, and where? So why do it first? There is an altruistic argument here that the body of work, which is academic peer-reviewed journals, is meant to be a permanent record of the highest quality research. So there is an argument for this being a good thing in its own right, to contribute to that store of knowledge and that archive, which will last and will, in theory, be readable and citable for many years to come. It's also true that some research funders absolutely expect you to do this. So it's true, I've listed some research funders here, for example, all the different arms of the UK RIs, that's the research councils, things like the Medical Research Council, the Economic and Social Research Council. They absolutely expect you to publish your research in peer-reviewed journals. NIHR, the National Institute of Health and Care Research, is a UK body that funds applied health and care research. They also absolutely expect you to publish your research here, as do Health and Care Research Wales, who are hosting this session today. There are other funders who will not be bothered. For example, if you're doing commissioned evaluation for a government department or for an organisation who perhaps are running a service and want it evaluated, they're probably not going to be bothered whether you ever publish it in a peer-reviewed journal or not. What they care about more is the report you write for them. However, if you work for a university, and I'm aware that not everybody on the call does, but some do, if you work for a university, absolutely universities expect it, and it's going to be part of your own personal kind of performance measures that you do publish such journal articles. And if you're part of any kind of centre or group that has infrastructure funding for research from Health and Care Research Wales or similar, again, it's absolutely part of the expectation that you do publish in these kinds of outlets. Personal CV building is also going to be very important particularly if you envisage any kind of research career. A bit less important if you are looking to build up your CV as a practitioner or a manager. But even then, it is definitely not going to do any harm. Increasingly these days, with the rise of more and more open access, it is a way of people noticing what you do. So more than ever, I think, journal articles are being published as open access. That means that anybody in the world can just click and open it. You don't have to have a subscription or be subscribed through a university or through the NHS Athens account or whatever. Makes it more likely that they will be read, opened and read. And increasingly these days, you get accompanying social media promotion, so the organization you work for might also be posting about the results of your research at the same time as the journal article is published. And if you work in a university, this will matter to you. If you don't, this won't. There is every few years a UK-wide national assessment of research performance called the Research Excellence Framework. The next one is 2029. It matters for that. Okay, so pros and cons of the different kinds of media then. Research reports often you need to write because a funder will require you to write a research report. The other positive reason for writing a research report which covers the whole of your study is being able to bring everything together. One of the issues with journal articles is that they tend to be focused on an aspect. If you're doing a large study with several parts, you're not going to get all of that into one journal article. In your research report, you can. So it's a good way of giving a proper overview of a whole study. Journal articles, I've already talked about the reasons for doing that. I guess that the downside, because I've got pros and cons on my header here, the downside of journal articles is that it can be quite slow. The whole point of academic journals is that they have this peer review process, yeah? So your article will be read by 2 or more people, can be up to, I think 5 is the largest number of reviewers I've ever had, who will read your article and comment in detail on it. Most commonly, in my experience, that's done anonymously. So they don't know who the authors are, although increasingly in some more health-related journals, it's becoming the done thing to not be anonymous for authors to be named and reviewers also to be named. But more traditionally, it's an anonymous process. Anyway, that's what we mean by peer review. And obviously that's quite slow because you have to wait for the reviewers to write their comments. Sometimes that takes several months. You then have to make changes, typically, before you get it accepted and send it back in, a revised version. All of that will take many months. So that's one downside of journal articles, is it can be quite slow. In some parts of academia, you will come across the edited book and also the authored book. And in that edited book, you might be asked, would you like to contribute a chapter? The pros of writing a chapter in someone's edited book is that you don't have as rigorous a process of peer review from a whole bunch of strangers. You're only dealing with the editor who you probably know to some degree. So it might be easier to actually get it out. The downside is not many people read them. Journal articles are much, much more widely read. One of my colleagues did say the other day that and this person had actually done an edited book, as being the editor of an edited book, and they said that it was a little bit like digging a big hole in the ground to bury your research in terms of the level of publicity that you get for your research by putting it in an edited book. Authored books matter in some disciplines and absolutely not at all in others. So, if you come from some parts of social science, let's say sociology is your thing, the authored book has, talking about a research monograph here, has a certain prestige. If you're talking in the more kind of STEM influenced disciplines, it usually doesn't. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to talk now mainly about journals, because I do think journal publishing is the way to go for most scenarios. A much more, with open access, it's a much more um, accessible way of getting your work out than it is by having it tucked away in a book, which requires that book to be bought, and often they're very, very expensive. So one thing to say that it is actually, I find it a very satisfying part of my job. It's hard work, sure, but when it works and when you get that paper out in print, um, it's a nice bit of public recognition for the efforts that you put in. I have seen one of my colleagues has got a mug. He had a mug made with his first ever journal paper. And you can see why. You know, people like to. It's a way of celebrating your efforts. You know, I did all this work to do this study. Perhaps it was part of a higher degree, or perhaps I was part of a team. Whatever, it doesn't matter. You put a lot of your heart and soul into it, and now actually you see it coming into the public domain, and that's a really nice, satisfying thing. Now, I'm going to address this comment to everybody on the call. It's probably especially true if you work in a university where, you know, it really is part of a university's metrics to get journal papers, less so in some other organizations. But there's absolutely no reason why in any job you should not be asking for support from your line manager to help you make time to do this writing as part of your job. I mean, some of you will be rolling your eyes and saying, "Oh, that's never going to happen," but there is no harm in asking. And if you do work in a role where research, you know, you are in a research role, then it's absolutely reasonable that you should ask for time for this. But the importance is going to depend on, is this something you have to do for reporting to the funders, or is it perhaps a paper from a study that you did elsewhere? In that case, your current line manager is probably going to be a bit less invested in it, and you've got to understand and appreciate that that is the case. As someone who recruits people to research posts, I would say that journal papers do matter. They matter when you're looking at people's CVs and people's job applications. And that's especially true of somebody being the lead author on a paper. If somebody has has publications, but none of them as lead author, that is, you know, probably less impressive than somebody who has fewer publications, but they are as lead author. If you have a PhD and have not published from it, I think that's probably not ideal. I don't think it's absolute deal breaker. So I would definitely encourage people who have doctorates and want to do more research. You really, really should try and publish from that doctorate. Don't avoid it. Don't ignore it. But it can happen that, given the way that research careers work, somebody may very quickly go on to then get then get a job on a project which is aside from that original PhD, doing something quite different. And so if you get lead author papers from that new project, even if you haven't quite got round yet to getting your PhD out in the world, that can still be a very good thing in terms of the state of your CV and applying for other jobs. And just think about what kind of help would be useful from more experienced colleagues. You know, can you ask people who have successfully published papers in journals to read drafts for you and comment? More pairs of eyes on papers is never a time wasted. I think it's always a good thing. Sometimes you do have conflicting sets of advice and you've got to deal with that, and that can be tricky, but better to have that advice than not have any advice at all, I always think. Okay, so there are disciplinary considerations here. So, you know, when you're thinking about where you send your research, this is what I'm thinking about here, really. So does it matter for your future career plans where you publish your research? You know, thinking about where you'd like to get jobs, who are you trying to impress, where do you think they might like to see your research published? And I'm going to give you some examples on a later slide, which are admittedly social care examples, but just to give you a sense of the kind of breadth of decision making there's quite a broad field of journals that you can choose from. You'll be aware that there's this thing called an impact factor, where a journal has a number attached, which says something about how well cited the papers in that journal are. Does that matter? What I've put on this slide here is no and yes. So I think officially the answer is no, in the sense that for things like the Research Excellence Framework, this every few years where they take stock of the quality of UK research, for that they say they say that, you know, the official line is we don't use them. We don't use journal impact factors. And the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment explicitly says you should not have hierarchies of journals. That said, in the culture of some subject areas, it still might matter. You know, people will still talk about impact factors when selecting journals, even if officially they're not meant to be featuring in the assessment of research quality. But also bear in mind that, you know, there may be a journal with a relatively low impact factor, but you know that people in your field read that journal, you know, in which case it still might be the place that you want to get your research noticed and published in order to be noticed. Thinking across the breadth of academia, social science journals, this is, you know, I'm from the broad field of social science. They tend to be lower impact than STEM journals, but they could still be the right place for you. It depends on who you want to read it, doesn't it? And you might decide that that social science journal is a better place for your paper to be read than trying hard to squeeze it into a medical journal, which will have a higher impact factor, but actually, you know, is not really where your readership exists. But if you are from, you know, the field of medical or healthcare research, then, you know, why not go for that higher impact medical journal, which, because there is prestige attached. If you can get a paper in the Lancet, you know, everybody will recognize that that is a really, really good thing to have on your CV. However, if what you really want is a job as a sociology lecturer, then possibly your recruiters aren't really going to care if it's in the Lancet or not. So here's my slide of examples, right? This is just examples from my own field of social care, but just to show you the breadth of decision making, really. So on the left of the slide, the left half of the slide, I've got specific journals listed, and I've clustered them by those based in the UK, those based in a European country. I mean, they may also be edited from the UK, but it doesn't matter. They're clearly European focused journals, and then those which are based in the USA. In social care, often there can be value in publishing in your own country because systems vary so much, but there can also be situations where it's good to send a paper outside of your own country. But then you have the whole wealth of medical journals in the third column along here. And I'm just families of journals is all I've got listed here, just to give you an idea of what exists that in this case might be relevant to child and family social care, which is what I was concerned with when I did this list. I did this list for another purpose. And then finally, onto the right-hand side of the slide, you've got much more general social science journals there, which are not specific in any way to social care, but still be places that you might want to publish in, depending on what audience you want to reach and what you want to be on your CV. Okay, so obviously for every subfield in health and social care, you'd need to do a different slide. That's just the one I did for my own research centre, Cascade, which is focused on children's social care. Right, the last few minutes then, I'm just going to say some things about strategies and tips for getting published. So notice here that there is a Health and Care Research Wales faculty training session coming up, which is called Shut Up and Write, which is a really nice title, which will be much more focused on this theme of how you get your paper actually written. My tips for what they're worth would be, do put time aside, but don't expect to have big blocks of time, because as you move on and spend more and more time in a research post, you will realize that big blocks of time simply don't exist. So I think you need to learn to squeeze this in. So do make time, but don't think that, oh, I can only do any writing on my journal article if I have a completely clear day, because that might actually be cloud cuckoo land. It may be that all you will ever have is the couple of hours at the beginning of a day. That's fine. Block them out and make sure that you use those couple of hours and gradually chip away at it. Sometimes you need to do journal article writing before other things that are more before other things. I think I have definitely come across colleagues who will only start working on a journal article when they essentially have a completely empty inbox. Yeah. I think that's probably not a realistic way to do it. I think if you think that, you're probably never going to get them written. I think that you have to put aside time. You have to think this is the core part of your job. And even if your to-do list still has quite a lot of things on it, you need to make that time for writing the journal articles anyway, and you need to juggle with other tasks. Doesn't have to be perfect. Better to have a first draft that still needs work than half a paper that's perfect. To quote that well-known phrase, don't get it right, get it written. And then there is this process of peer review, such as I mentioned earlier, and many of you probably already know about, where usually anonymous experts from around the world will give you comments on your paper. It's really, really important that you don't crumble in the face of these. The first ever time you get comments back on your paper, you will be crushed, because you put all that effort in, and then what you get back from journal reviewers is often more criticism than it is affirmation. You usually get, yeah, we think there's value in this paper, but we think you need to do these 15 things before it's going to be publishable. And when you first see that list, it can be quite crushing, but it's really, really important that you can learn to be resilient about those, because that's absolutely crucial to the process of getting papers out there. You need to essentially suck it up, do as you're told, and get on with your life. Not sweat over it, not angst over it, but just work your way steadily through that list of revisions. If you really think you can't do them, say back to the journal that you can't do them and give a reason. Make a list of those peer reviewers' comments, turn it into a table. So you've got a column on the left and a column on the right. And for every single comment, you give a response and you say, yeah, I've changed that. Have a look on page 4. Or you say, I thought really hard about that, but actually we can't change it for this reason. But you've got to address everyone. If you do address everyone and you more or less do as they say, it's actually quite hard for them to not accept that paper in the end. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop talking.